with that.
Okay, so great to have everyone here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just a few disclaimers. We are recording today's session, and it is also being live streamed on the Cofrin Logan Center's YouTube page. You were likely given an opportunity to consent to that when you joined the meeting, but just so everyone is aware. So welcome to the first lecture of the Fall 2020 Cofrin Logan Center Seminar Series. My name is Dr. Michael Amlung, and I'm the Associate Director for Training of the CLC. I want to welcome all of you who are part of our KU CLC family, and also extend a special welcome to our friends of the center who are joining us from other KU departments, as well as other universities around the US and likely a couple from Canada as well. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, I wanted you to know the Cofrin Logan Center was established in 2018 as a hub to bring together researchers, practitioners, and KU students and partners to address challenges in addiction. Before I introduce today's distinguished speaker, I want to explain a little bit about how today's webinar will work. As you can see, Dr. Johnson will be presenting his slides on the screen, and will have full video and voice and the ability to control his own slides. A small selection of attendees will have the option of turning on their video feed. This was mostly just to kind of keep the number down so that it's not as overwhelming, the number of videos on the screen. Other attendees do not have the ability to turn on their video, but nonetheless, we asked everybody to mute their microphones now and keep them muted for the duration of the talk. At the end of the talk, we will have some time for questions. This will be a moderated Q&A, so if you have questions, on the bottom of the Zoom window, there's a Q&A button. You can type those in. Myself and the other moderators will take a look at them. And then the way we're going to try and do this at the end of the talk is I will call out a name of a question that we've selected and temporarily unmute your microphone so you can answer those questions to Dr. Johnson. We've practiced this a few times and we hope it will go smoothly, but unfortunately we're not going to have time to get to everyone's questions. I want to acknowledge and thank Sergey Grudnevsky and Drew Rosedal for their coordination and logistical support. So without any further ado, I'm thrilled to announce our first speaker in the CLC seminar series. Today, we're very fortunate to have a true international leader in the area of psychedelic research and treatment joining us today. Dr. Matthew Johnson is Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Johnson earned his PhD in experimental psychology at the University of Vermont, and then completed a postdoc at Johns Hopkins before continuing to join their faculty. He is a leader in the field as a past president of APA Division 28 and the current president of the International Society for Research on Psychedelics. It's perhaps no surprise to some of you that he's one of the world's most published scientists on the human effects of psychedelics, and has also conducted highly influential research in the area of behavioral economics of drug use, addiction, and other risk behaviors. He authored the safety guidelines for psychedelic use and has done a number of studies on tobacco addiction, as well as cancer, distress, and some other mental health issues as well. And I think what's a true marker of his reputation is his extensive media coverage, including a recent national television segment on 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper, which I think is phenomenal, and we're all perhaps a little jealous of that media coverage. So we're truly lucky today to have an opportunity to hear from one of the world's foremost experts in this exciting and expanding area of addiction science. So today, Dr. Johnson will present a talk entitled Psychedelic Science, Behavioral, and Therapeutic Effects of Psilocybin. On behalf of the Cofrin Logan Center, welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Oh, thank you very much, Michael. I have to say it's a particular honor presenting for you all. So not only is Kansas absolutely legendary in the field of behavior analysis, which is my home discipline, but it's chock full of what I consider some of the absolute best behavioral researchers, particularly in behavioral economics in the world. And of course, yourself, Michael, and Rich Yeast. Thank you so much, Rich, for roping me into this. And we go way back studying behavioral economics back in the Bickle Lab, 20 some years ago. And of course, Dave Jamalowicz, Derek Reed. I mean, so anyway, I couldn't ask for a better group of behavioral researchers to present before. So thank you all for the opportunity to speak. And so I'll dig into some of this psychedelic research. Let's see if I can control my slides here. So, excuse me, I'm pinning my video to open up some of my screen space. So Yeah, I'm going to present on behavioral and therapeutic effects of psilocybin. Worked with some other psychedelics, but it's primarily going to be psilocybin. I'll explain a little more what that's about. I do want to mention by way of disclosures, I do advise a number of companies that are exploring the medical development of psychedelic compounds or analogs for FDA pathway. So I'm showing those up on the screen. Uh, and in this field, we tend to take ourselves very seriously because, you know, we want it to be about the science, but sometimes we can go too far. So I'm throwing up a little joke here. It's a visual one. I'll let you kind of read it and absorb. And there's no contingency. I can't hear the feedback or any laughter. So there's usually a bimodal distribution for the of the laughs. Usually folks see the count, and that's just funny because it's Sesame Street, which is awesome. And then it's for folks who might know a little more about the nature of adverse experiences on psychedelics. There's the count turning the 8 hours into the infinity symbol, which is not the way you deal with patients or research participants having a challenging psychedelic effect. But just a little humor there. So some of you may have come across the news back in the fall in the world that existed a million years ago before the pandemic hit us. Some news in our group, even though we've been doing research for about 20 years, I've been involved with the psychedelic research since 2004. We've actually been elevated to the level of a nominal center, which basically means at a university, a certain amount of money allows you the opportunity to use that name center. So this was a $17 million donation from a number of organizations, Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, and the other is really a group of folks that Tim Ferriss, for those of you familiar with him, he and a number of his friends basically got together and put together the other half of this $17 million. And so we're extremely thankful. This has really allowed us to take this work to the next level. We've done most of it on a very small amount of philanthropy. Much of what I'm going to show you is done really on a wing and a prayer with very, very limited resources, but we'll be able to take it to the next level with that funding. So I mentioned psilocybin. That's the active agent in over 200 known species of mushrooms. That list of species continues to grow as we discover more species. It's a classic psychedelic, meaning it's in the same group as LSD, mescaline, dimethyltryptamine. Other drugs like MDMA, PCP, ketamine, even cannabis are sometimes called psychedelic, but that's in a broader, kind of much more loose sense. The classic psychedelics have a common pharmacological mechanism of being agonist at the serotonin 2A receptor, and they largely share similarities in terms of their effects. We know 2A is the primary mediating mechanism. For those familiar with drug discrimination, where an animal can tell you essentially behaviorally whether it's had a certain type of drug or not. We know that these drugs produce clear discriminative stimulus effects. There's cross discrimination amongst these different compounds. We know that antagonists that block the 2A receptor block both human subjective effects and a non-human animal's ability to discriminate those effects in discriminative stimulus studies. And we know that the affinity or the stickiness of a particular compound across compounds is well correlated with the potency or the amount of mass of a particular molecule that you need to achieve a psychoactive effect. And I'll show you some of those data here that Glennon showed in 1984, which was really a key finding, just a remarkably tight correlation between human potency and the 2A receptor affinity. And interestingly, a lot of those data came from an unusual scientific character, but a real legend in the field. I'm showing you a picture of myself with him here, Sasha, or Alexander Shulgin. This was me visiting his lab, which was basically an old shed. In 2007, I think this was. But he has synthesized hundreds of compounds, most of which are psychoactive, based on either the structure of tryptamine, similar to psilocybin, or the structure of phenethylamine, similar to mescaline. And it'll probably be hundreds of years before science fully realizes the potential of all of these pharmacological tools that he has discovered by the way of these various compounds. So many of the different compounds that he created actually went into that correlation that I just showed you, which was, as I said, critical and showing 2A to be the primary mechanism. Just briefly, behaviorally, we know one of the things we know about these compounds is they're not good reinforcers. I'll talk a little more about the abuse later on, but they're probably the best work that I know of in the area has been conducted by my colleague, Bill Fanagrossi. I'm showing some of that work here in monkeys, showing that compared to the level of self-administration that you get with that horizontal thin line on the screen, at around the number 7 on the y-axis, that compared to that, the level that you normally get was from saline, that you get with these various classic psychedelics, you get very low levels of self-administration. They found a little bit of transient reinforcement, but it only lasted a couple of sessions in that study. And by and large, these drugs, in a lot of cases, in fact, look like punishers. Animals will avoid their administration. So very different than the other drugs of abuse, drugs that humans use recreationally in that sense. They have an absolutely ancient use of use, and in fact, prehistorical use. The oldest records of use, and I'm showing you some cave paintings on the rightmost panel there from northern Africa. Those date back to around 9,000 years ago. So this is several thousand years before the first human civilizations pop up in Mesopotamia. So absolutely prehistorical, showing you some other evidence from Mexico, other areas of Mesoamerica and South America in the left and central panels, all suggestive of sacramental or ceremonial use of these compounds. Fast forward through some millennia to the 40s to the 70s, psychedelics were intensely investigated as research tools and also as therapeutics, with promising findings in helping terminal cancer patients and also in treating alcoholism. And then there were the dark ages. Despite preliminary promising findings, unfortunately, there was a decades-long dormancy where really no human research happened for a few decades. And this was a reaction to not only some very real casualties that were seen in the non-supervised recreational use of these drugs when they became popular, particularly LSD in the late 60s, but also probably even more so the sensationalism surrounding these drugs, and really a conflating of these areas where we essentially came to believe you can't even trust researchers to do safe research with these compounds. And you had one or two kind of poster children at Harvard. So Tim Leary being foremost, who was kind of a wild man before he ever knew anything about psychedelics, but nonetheless, he went off the rails in terms of his, telling teenagers to turn on, tune in, and drop out, that type of thing. And especially once he was kicked out of Harvard. So that kind of became a poster child for folks to say, look, you can't even trust these scientists with this stuff. Meanwhile, most of the scientists were begging Leary to tone it down and to convey more of a balanced message of safety. So then we went from those dark ages to, kind of a modern, it's been called a renaissance, or you can call it an age of enlightenment. I'm showing you the, with reference to Voltaire over on the right, showing you the PubMed hits on this chart, showing the hits for psychedelic or hallucinogen synonyms, going back to 1980 and showing that there was this really stable baseline until the early 2000s. And 2004 is when I jumped in this area. And since, I got into it at the right time, it's really, skyrocketed and shown this, what looks like an exponential rate of growth. So I do want to, I don't have much time for it, but I just really want to quickly go over the dark side. I mean, there is abuse potential and there are risks. And the important factor here is that we have, just like other medical interventions and other research interventions, we have very reasonable mitigating strategies that we employ. We know what the risks are, and we have ways to specifically minimize those risks to an acceptable level. So the biggies are, they can cause harm with people that have a predisposition for psychotic disorders. If you're hanging on to consensus view of reality by a thread, the last thing you need is a big dose of a psychedelic. And then for anyone, the fear, the panic, the confusion that can happen during the actual psychedelic experience, people call that a bad trip. And in clinical settings, we refer to these as challenging experiences. They can actually be very meaningful and clinically helpful to people, these difficult experiences, much like deep psychotherapy. Nonetheless, in an uncontrolled environment, sometimes people do things that are dangerous. Sometimes people die. It's pretty rare, but yeah, these are very intoxicating drugs. And just like a high dose of alcohol, sometimes people do things stupid when they're not in a safe environment. Modest pressors, raising the pulse and blood pressure. So people at extreme cardiovascular risk, that's an issue. They cause something we've published on. They cause headaches the day following use, typically mild to moderate, nothing that would prevent medical use. Mysterious disorder, very small number of people, never seen in research, but this persisting perceptual, hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder. It's a rare DSM diagnosis. Emerging evidence suggests that it might be some rare neurological susceptibility, and is actually seems to be prompted by drugs also aside from hallucinogens. So it might be a more general phenomenon, but nonetheless.
Matt, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you could just pause for just a second. We are working on getting some audio back. Hang on just a second. Matt, we're wondering if it's something on your end possibly, because people are saying they can hear me. I don't.
Yeah. Matt, can you try unmuting and speaking again?
How about anything right now?
Yeah, we got it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I reset my audio interface somehow. But okay. Yeah. Flag me down if we stop again. But let's see. I'm not quite sure where I cut out, but I'll just move on in the spirit of time here. I went over. Suffice it to say, there's plenty of dangers, not encouraging, the reckless use or illicit use of these compounds. Moving on to, and we have plenty of work published on that, so that's easy to find. Reach out to me if you need help finding those references. Our earliest work in our group really looked at really these profound subjective effects that have often been reported and healthy normals, so not therapeutic studies. And so the biggest take homes from that research is that we found improvements in mood and quality of life over a year after sessions. And our second study was one in which we administered a placebo and 4 different active doses of psilocybin under double-blind conditions, and found that increasing the psilocybin dose had an orderly effect on mystical experience. I'll explain that in a minute, what that is, challenging experience, or bad trips, if you will, and long-term positive attribution. So clearly, context or set and setting have a strong role, and these are optimized environments in a pleasant environment. Nonetheless, these types of data with that graded effect that I'm showing you, even on on such a non-traditional measure as this, I'm showing you the percentage of participants who rated the experience as among the 5 most spiritually significant of their lives. Even on a non-traditional pharmacological assessment like that, you get this beautiful dose-related effect. So clearly some real pharmacology going on here. I mentioned mystical experience. That sounds woo-woo, I admit it. You know, I'm a behavior analyst at heart, so I'm a skeptical type, but it's important to realize that what this does refer to a psychometrically validated experience. It's nominally divorced from any so-called supernatural, spiritual, in that sense, or religious beliefs. It goes back, having roots with William James. He was fascinated by the idea that these different accounts of extraordinary human experiences across the centuries, across different parts of the globe, described in different languages, associated with different religions and outside of religion, had these remarkable commonalities. And these included an overwhelming sense of unity, positive mood, transcending time and space, and ineffability, or the sense that the experience was beyond words. And I'm showing you here this MEQ30 is a scale we developed based on psilocybin data, which is the first psychometrically developed scale that's actually designed to assess this type of mystical experience from an acute experience. So you also use that for meditation or other experiences as well. So that's out there. But nonetheless, we found time and time again now that the rates of those types of experiences are extremely high in a dose-related way with psilocybin. We've also found that across those 2 initial studies that psilocybin increases personality dimension of openness. Now, the definition of personality is that it doesn't change. We know there are certain things like getting older changes it. In fact, that decreases on average personality openness, and certain things and like certain clinical treatments can have an effect. But this is the first example that we are aware of any relatively discrete experimental manipulation ever changing a validated personality construct. And openness refers to a broad-minded tolerance to other people's points of view, the ability to see things from a both and rather than an either or framework, appreciation for aesthetics. So we found that this was increased with psilocybin, and not just from getting psilocybin. Digging into the data, even amongst people who got a high dose of psilocybin, it was the people who had a full mystical experience defined by meeting those criteria for those various dimensions that I mentioned. People who had the same dose of psilocybin who didn't have that type of subjective experience, we saw no change. So it really seems to be driven by the nature of the experience that one has, not just getting the drug. And you'll see that theme crop up again and again. Moving on to some of our clinical work, this was our cancer patients. Cancer study, picking up on older research done with LSD for cancer patients in the 1960s. These were 51 cancer patients. They all had life-threatening cancer. They all had a DSM-4 diagnosis, either of involving depressed mood, some of which is major depressive disorder, or one of the anxiety disorders. So about a third had a depressive disorder, a third anxiety, and about a third a combo of both. And in fact, I think one day, we're going to have existential distress or something like that in the DSM. There's some reason to think it's scientifically distinct as a construct from garden variety depression and anxiety. There's something about existential distress with a potentially terminal illness. So the study design was within subjects. Everyone had 2 psilocybin sessions. One was a high dose, the real deal, and one was a trivial dose, really meant to just serve to control for expectancy. People might feel a little bit of something, but maybe even not. But so essentially a placebo. So people had screening, and then they were randomized to get either the high dose first, and then a follow-up 5 weeks later, and then the trivial dose, the comparison dose, or the opposite order of that, and then another follow-up for clinical symptoms 5 weeks later, and then a 6-month follow-up. And here I'm showing you the outcomes on our Hamilton depression and anxiety inventories, some gold standard measures, and we looked at others, and they showed the same story. But people came in at clinically severe levels. You trust me on that if you're not familiar with these levels. Both groups looked the same before randomization, so that's good. Very high levels. Those randomized to the high dose group, post 1 is 5 weeks after the first session. And so you see dramatic reductions into the non-clinical. Most people are not satisfying clinical criteria at this point. This is a squarely normal range. Dramatic reduction. The folks in the trivial dose group, the low dose group, also saw a significant reduction, probably through the rapport building, and what we call the placebo effect. But nonetheless, nowhere near and statistically differentiated from the high dose group. And then amazingly, 10 weeks after that, so now this is 5 weeks after everyone's gotten that second dose. So now everyone has gotten the real deal high dose, whether it was 5 weeks or 10 weeks ago. And now both randomized groups are down to that extremely low level of clinical distress. And the same basic story plays out whether it's depression on the left or anxiety on the right. Huge effect sizes showing you at the bottom for those statistically inclined. And continuing with that theme, we see that the clinical, that the mystical experience assessed through subjective questionnaires at the end of the session day showed statistically significant correlations to the reduction in both depression and anxiety long term. So it's not just us, I can't get into the details, but a very similar study done with a somewhat smaller group of folks done by our good colleagues at New York University found extremely similar, very large, of a similar size, large effect size with a slightly different design. We published those at the same time. Some other work with an open label pilot conducted by our colleagues at Imperial College London. Very similar. They found people, these were not cancer patients, but major depressive disorder outside of cancer, found large reductions on depression that appeared to be sustained even out to 3 months. And showing you, we've recently had it accepted into JAMA Psychiatry, but we've done with major depression outside of cancer again, a randomized trial in the form of a waitlist control randomization study, found, again, very large reductions in depressive symptoms in major depressive patients. So keep your eye out for those results soon. I'll move into our addiction work, showing you just one of the rationales for this work, the meta-analysis of older LSD studies for the treatment of alcoholism, showing you the odds ratio of improvement. So showing you here that across those the only 6 randomized studies in the field, that there was a statistical effect that equated to essentially doubling the odds of success at the first follow-up. Compared to whatever the different comparison conditions were, which differed across those studies, and in aggregate extremely significant. And, you know, more importantly, the large effect size, again, a doubling of the odds ratio of about 2. So also some older work on LSD treating heroin addiction, which looked promising. One study on that. So I looked into starting very early out saying, hey, what about smoking? It appears to be this cross addiction signal. I had a lot of experience in smoking, very quantifiable. I kind of see it as a clean form of addiction. It's hardcore addiction, but typically no one's like wife or husband has left them, you know, their career's intact. So it's like the pure self-control problem with that probably some of my delayed discounting colleagues on the call would sort of probably agree is see really as a heart of addiction, this, you know, what's good for you now, what's good for you later, being in competition, very much at play with smoking. So let's try that. So this was an open label study, didn't have a lot of money to throw at it. So besides being a good model of addiction, it's also kind of a clinical problem itself. If you think about mortality or deaths, I'm showing you the deaths per year in the US, about 500,000 a year in the United States, absolutely dwarfs even alcohol, and then all of the illicit drugs. They barely show up on the same screen visually when you compare it to tobacco. So it's absolutely staggering. So and most people who smoke in the U.S. actually want help, which, I mean, just the unmet clinical need is staggering. So we appreciate, as Michael mentioned, its work gets some media attention. We always appreciate that. We wish that was the case for all science in society, but we're lucky enough to have some in this area. I have to say, though, we don't have control over all of the headlines. I'll say you probably got my point now. There are risks. I'm not encouraging anyone to use these things illicitly. But I definitely want to put special emphasis on this. Don't eat this many mushrooms. That's insane. That's a lot of mushrooms in that bowl. So definitely don't do that. But definitely, yeah, you got me. Demographics. These were first 15 people. They were real deal smokers. The important things were they'd been smoking for an average of over 30 years and smoking on average about a pack a day. These were not lightweights. It was a 15-week protocol where we combine it with cognitive behavioral therapy, pretty standard cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the main backdrop for most smoking cessation psychotherapies. And 3 psilocybin sessions spread out over an 8-week period. The first psilocybin session was on their target quit date. We used 2 biological measures of success, cotinine in the urine and carbon monoxide in the breath. Here I'm showing the carbon monoxide results. This is before psilocybin, and this is after psilocybin. You don't need to be a stats whiz to tell you probably have a pre-post difference here. And what that equated to in terms of point prevalence, the percentage of people at any given time at various follow-ups, is that at 6 months, 80% of these folks were biologically confirmed as smoke-free, and that held up to 60% at an average of 2.5 years. This is just staggering compared. It's open label, so we can't determine causation. So maybe we were lucky, but in terms of asking, like, is this worthy of follow-up? I mean, this absolutely dwarfs anything in the published literature. So is this worthy of follow-up? The answer was absolutely yes. And I haven't shown these data before, but something that we're working up now, or just a little bit of behavioral economics data. Don't have too much time to explain, but it's a standard cigarette purchasing tasks, hypothetical purchasing tasks, showing demand curves for folks in the study. One of the things that shook out here is that people who ended up eventually being a treatment success had lower intensity of demand. So probably not surprisingly, it seemed by this measure appeared to be the harder cases that were less susceptible to treatment with psilocybin. So hopefully that's like in other areas of addiction treatment. I think this is one of the useful areas for demand analysis. And then we also found, even amongst the so-called failures, the people that that weren't completely absent, we did see, both in terms of real cigarettes and also what I'm showing you here, a significant reduction in their hypothetical purchasing demand for cigarettes. So nonetheless, it might be signs of improvement even with the folks who didn't achieve complete abstinence. So back to mystical experience, like with cancer, like with the healthy normals, like with personality change, we found that the degree of mystical experience had some relationship to long-term success. And this study is ongoing, and we're just about to start it back up very cautiously with extra precautions with the pandemic. But we're most of the way through a randomized comparative efficacy trial, randomizing 40 folks to psilocybin, 40 folks to nicotine patch treatment with the same cognitive behavioral therapy. And right now, for the 44 people who have gotten through the 12-month follow-up, 59% are abstinent. And we only used we scaled back to 1 psilocybin session, mainly for experimental reasons. It's too much to get into here, but 59% biologically confirmed success rate, 1-year follow-up. So this is still, results could change, it's in progress, but this is a number of people most of the way through the study. If I had to have made up data, which I would never do, but if I did, I wouldn't make them up, this good, because like no one would believe it. So needless to say, we're still very encouraged. Again, could change, and we're keeping an eye on the data. Just very briefly, we are doing, in collaboration with colleagues at the National Institute on Drug Abuse Intramural Research Program, which is next door to us on our campus, we are doing fMRI imaging. Elliot Stein's lab is donating those resources because they're so interested in these results. We're doing fMRI, and we're also doing some behavioral and cognitive tasks associated with that. One of the things that's jumped out to us so far, a preliminary analysis of some of these people, is improvements in cognitive control as measured by this IMSIT task. It's called the Oddball Task. Basically, it's like the Stroop task. You have to resist a prepotent urge and you're supposed to use the finger that's not in the spatial location of the target digit, but you're supposed to select the finger number of the oddball digit. So again, it's a little confusing with the time we have, but you have to resist the urge to do something sort of relatively kind of automatic, like a Stroop task. And we found that the people who quit psilocybin compared to the people who quit the next day, and pretty much everyone was quit the next day, so that's not a confound. Compared to the people who quit with the nicotine patch, we found substantial improvements in this so-called incongruency effect, and that was driven by the interference trials. So you had an improvement, a lower less of a slowing in reaction time when people were faced with these trials where there was a conflict between what was automatic and what they were supposed to do. So I'm thinking maybe some extrapolation, but kind of like what some of our patients tell us. They feel like they get like there's a shift. They say they deal with cravings in a much more mindful way. Like one participant said it was like this. He says, now the cravings came out of nowhere. It was like automaticity, we call it in the smoking research. Like their hand ends up in their pocket and the cigarette's in the mouth automatically. Don't have cigarettes, you drive into the 7-Eleven automatically. You're on autopilot. Now it's like the craving comes and he says, I'm like Neo in the movie The Matrix. Everything's in slow motion. It's like, oh, there's a cigarette craving. I quit smoking a week ago. This is going to pass in a few minutes. No big deal. I got this. I can like bend out of the way, let the bullet go by, say bye-bye. So, you know, maybe some extrapolating there, but again, following the data, maybe that's what these data are pointing to. So it's not just smoking. Our good colleague, Mike Bogenschutz at NYU, he started this work at University of New Mexico, but did a pilot study with alcohol use disorder with psilocybin, open label, just like ours, in 10 people, found similarly very dramatic reductions. He has now also moved on to a 100-person randomized clinical trial, which I think he's recently wrapped up, so stay tuned. I've also published a number of studies in our lab, basically documenting these stories of people out there, and there's now thousands of them that say, and I started this because people just started reaching out to me when I'd show our lab data, and they're like, this happened to me. And sometimes they say, this happened to me 30 years ago, or, you know, 5 years ago, that they had a psychedelic session, like, or experience just because they were partying, and they're like, what the hell am I doing? They quit smoking, they quit drinking. And so we've collected these stories. It doesn't show causal effect, but just sort of to catalog this, and some things have popped out, like the nature of the withdrawal, too much to go into, but we think there's some value there in terms of you know, getting these stories down, and it's pointed us into some different clinical directions. Like we're now starting an opioid treatment study, and that was one of the things we studied in this survey work. And we're also, it looks like we're going to have some funding for cannabis use disorder treatment. There was a number of people said, yeah, they quit smoking weed because they had a psychedelic session, which is intriguing. So wrapping up here, like what's really going on here? So you should be justifiably curious about a snake oil effect. What are you telling me, Matt? This stuff works for everything? I don't think it's going to work for everything, but if things hold up, it seems to be promising for a number of nominally distinct disorder. What's going on here? Is this snake oil? I think the alternative is, if there's something going on here, it's got to be common mechanisms. I think in the spirit of RDoC or, you know, transdiagnostic mechanisms and across disorders, keeping in mind that psychiatry, unlike other areas of medicine, is largely descriptive. We really don't know, you know, those different categories aren't based on a real mechanistic understanding, but on a descriptive understanding. I think this research is pointing us to common mechanisms. I really think of a number of these disorders as addiction broadly defined, whether it is the addiction to the behaviors and thoughts, which I view as just behaviors associated with a form of a frequent substance use, or whether the thoughts and behaviors associated with depressive disorder, the self-persecutory thoughts, I'm a failure, no one likes me, I'm just, you know, this is my lot in life, that type of thing, or with anxiety, that all of these are essentially addiction broadly defined. It's a stuckness. It's a local min in calculus terms, and once you're in that rut, it's very difficult to get out of it. And I don't have time to go into it, but some intriguing work in the area, some of which we've recently replicated, is that these brain networks, the way that brain areas communicate with each other, seems to be a very meaningful acute outcome. Like these drugs seem to do some very interesting things in terms of increasing connectivity between brain areas that don't normally communicate. And combine that with psychiatric research saying a growing number of psychiatric disorders are associated with abnormal brain network or brain communication signatures. It may be what we're doing, very crudely, I admit it, the description at this point, we're shaking the snow globe up, and somehow we're normalizing these systems. So I think that might just be the biological side, perhaps, of what I think we can have more confidence in, is behaviorally. These seem to be behaviorally plastic manipulations, and that can blast people out of their ruts. And that's and so perhaps it's also pointing us to, like, what the heck are these 2A? We don't know much about serotonin 2A endogenously. We know it's more expressed in mammals than other animals, more expressed in the human than others. They're major computational units in the CNS. I would say it may be that they have a very important role in modulating what you can call meaning, maybe put in another way, mental or behavioral plasticity. So even broader than therapeutics, like kind of pointing to what's going on with the 2A receptor. And I think about these as powerful learning experiences. And I think about the simplest kind of classic Rescola-Wagner learning model, where in it, there's advancements, but it counts for a whole lot of experimental data, where you have basically the amount that's learned on a trial is a product of basically the thing learned, or the difference between what you expect and what is novel, and the salience of a trial. You hike up the stimulus light brightness, and a rat learns more on that trial. Okay, now what happens when you embed one of these treatments, like say quitting smoking, into a trial where people come out of it and say, this was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life that I'll never forget? Is that kind of like jacking up the house light to like a millionfold? Just kind of a way to think about this behaviorally to track. And then another way to say this is that Michael Pollan in his book credited me with this dope slap effect, which I wish it sounded more scientific, but I think it sums it up. He says, I believe that psychedelics can use to change all sorts of behavior. It's their ability to sufficiently dope slap people out of their story. Psychedelics open a window of mental flexibility in which people can let go of the mental models that they use to organize reality. So again, a lot of hand waving there, admittedly. We have a lot to fill in, but that'll be the fun work. So a number of ongoing studies, including our smoking study, treatment of mood in Alzheimer's patients, anorexia, another trial with depression we're running. It's a multi-site trial. A number of other studies. I'm PI on opioid addiction and PTSD. Also a new study we've got funding for to use LSD to treat chronic pain. And a number of other interesting studies, but I am out of time. I will wrap up there and thank a large number of wonderful colleagues, and I'm surely forgotten a number of them on this slide because it's such a group effort, and the funding that's come from these organizations that have stepped in a vacuum of funding and made this possible. So yeah, that's about it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt. We are very excited to hear about your work, and I think that you've clearly been a leader in this, and also bringing rigorous scientific methods to an area that, as you said, went through a bit of a dark age, but it seems like it really is growing a lot of momentum. We see a lot about psychedelics and psilocybin on Twitter and other social media platforms. So I think you're definitely leading the charge on this. We're going to go ahead and go to our Q&A. So Matt, you can leave your microphone and video unmuted through all of this. And what we're going to do is kind of selectively unmute people. So our first question comes from our director of the CLC, Dr. Rich Yee.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for that great talk. It was a lot of fun and interesting. So while I have the mic, a couple of quick questions, both of which I suspect you've probably gotten a number of times. The first is, have you given any thought or explored the idea of that there are certain kind of moderating factors at the individual level that, number one, either impacts the likelihood that somebody will sign up for a study when you're giving psychedelics, right? And or the likelihood that somebody will have an effect. So for example, something like suggestibility. That's not my research area, but is there some sort of moderating factor that likely impacts who this will work on, right? So that's my first question. I suspect we've gotten done. The second one is, I really love the snow globe example. One implication of that is that that's like a reset, right? And it's not necessarily, it implies long-term protective factors, right? So in other words, you reset. If the person goes right back into kind of an environment in which the contingencies are structured a certain way, they could easily slip back into that direction, right? So that really the effect is, like as you said, it's kind of like that snow globe, but it doesn't mean long-term protective factors, or it doesn't necessarily. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, gosh, those are some really great questions. So the first one, in terms of likelihood of treatment, and the first spin on that is one I don't know that I've gotten before, and it's like a killer question. The likelihood of even signing up for this. I don't know of any data to speak to that, and I think it's a very strong guess that people who are more open in general are more likely to sign up for this. Frankly, one of the reasons that I got into the smoking work is that as fascinated I am about these subjective effects, the mystical experience and all of that, you know, I'm a behaviorist at heart. And one, I want to see real, especially biologically confirmable behavior change, but also the smokers. I really enjoy working with them most. And I have a feeling it's going to be the same way with the other addicted populations we move into, that, you know, some of the other studies are like, the folks are great. It's like, but some of the folks have been interested in, you know, kind of new agey type, not everyone, but new agey type, you know, retreats. And this is kind of one more thing, like the 30-day silent retreat they went on and this type of thing. And so that kind of speaks to maybe like the selection bias in terms of who even signs up. But so many of the smokers are like, now some of them might be in that category, not many, but most of them are like, it's consistent with what we know about smokers. Like I presented the data earlier, most smokers want to quit and they've tried a bunch of things. So most of these folks are like, yeah, this sounds kind of wacky, but I've tried everything else except the kitchen sink. And boy, this sounds like the kitchen sink. So it's Hopkins. So why not? Seems safe enough. Like, let's give it a go. And I kind of like that. They're not really like very loaded, it seems, with the expectations. And so I love those folks, the folks that you would never guess, like they would never, unless they were trying to quit smoking and answer that, they would never like seek out anything associated with a psychedelic, but don't have it'll be good to get actually some more data to speak more squarely on that. In terms of predicting response, we've looked at it a number of times and haven't found anything. Franz Vollenweider, his lab in Switzerland, it's done a bunch of good work. They're one of the top other labs in the world, one of the top 3, I would say. They have found that the personality domain of neuroticism has predicted more difficult responses. And related to what you said about suggestibility, we're collecting some data now that might speak to it, but we don't have it yet. But there is a good reason to think suggestibility is at play. Some earlier experimental work with psychedelics showed that with acute models of suggestibility, that suggestibility was increased. Even things like, do you start swaying your body, like because you're copying a confederate in the room, like interesting stuff like that. But then also this construct of the absorption trait, like the Tellegen absorption scale, which is very much related to suggestibility. It's like, and also related to, do you suspend disbelief when you're, you know, watching a movie or reading a novel? That the 2A receptor, that people who have a certain allele for the 2A receptor in combination with one of the alleles for the comp dopaminergic loci, that one of the SNPs for the serotonin 2A coding loci shows a statistical relationship to increased absorption. So that you put that together, 2A, absorption, and I should say Franz Vollenweider has found, in addition to neuroticism, that stronger acute effects in the lab have been shown with the Tellegen absorption scale. So triangulating there, I think there's something there. So let's see, that was your first question. The second, you might have to give me a brief reminder. The second topic was,
I wonder if you don't mind, if we go to, we do have quite a long list of questions, if that's okay. I'd like to hear from someone else, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Our next question is going to come from Kimber Richter.
Hey, yes, thanks so much for your talk. I really, really appreciate it. And I have a choice of questions, so I'm going to go with this one because I guess I have a number of friends, et cetera, who are dealing with this. It seems like anorexia and eating disorders are really, they're getting more prevalent. They're very deadly. We have really rotten treatments for it that have very little reach. And they seem to be almost a disorder of sort of excess control. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think psychedelic behavior change might help with that. And also I wondered if you'd ever measured reactance and what the psychotropics do to reactance.
Let's see, in terms of why we think it would work for anorexia, we certainly saw we're thinking there's some commonality to what we saw in our cancer, work, this kind of, in a sense, what can become a kind of a disorder of meaning and identity. I mean, using very broad terms there, but in that sense, we think maybe there's something that can shift in these anorexic patients. Those are kind of broad strokes, but we're thinking that emotional regulation might be a relevant construct here that might be at play for them, and perhaps related. I just showed you a bit of the data on cognitive control. There that might have some relevance. So we are, it's frankly, we're stabbing a bit, and this might be a boundary condition. It may be that we've run a few people in that study. It seems like for some people it's been meaningful, but it's way too early on to really have any very strong guess. But and I'm not actually familiar with reactants. I'm not familiar with that, exactly what that would be referring to.
Well, there's some scales out there, and they really measure, sort of the FU response to being told to do things. So, sorry,
right,
I can't think of another way to summarize it. And when I work a lot with smokers, and I think folks are tired and have tried a million things, but also there's some people who just kind of like to go their own way, and they don't like to be told to do things. And so it's kind of the flip side of some of the stuff you were talking about. And I just wonder whether you had looked into that.
No, that's interesting, and I'd like to look further into that. And I have to say, I keep learning more about anorexia. Of course, like our core team is not experts in that, but we are working with a top anorexia expert at Hopkins, Angela Guarda, with that. And I'm curious, to kind of learn what more might be known about that, and especially if there is that. So many of our smokers talk about this, that kind of FE, that independence, that rebel, like it's a part of their identity. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like that actually is important. Part of the CBT is talking about like, and sometimes what comes out of these sessions is like, I don't need to do this to tap into that part of me. That's an authentic part of myself that I don't need this to latch onto that. So anyway, that really strikes me as an interesting way to look at it, and we'll see.
Okay, we're now going to go to Robert LeConte.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much for your talk. I just kind of had a question about some of the behind the scenes aspects. I guess specifically, what are some of the regulatory challenges that you face in getting psychedelic studies approved compared to other non-psychedelic drugs that you've worked with?
Great question, and good to see you, Rob. Rob, one of the research assistants extraordinaire that has come out of our research unit and is now in Kansas. So great to see you. It's a challenge. I mean, these are Schedule I drugs, and it basically takes about anywhere from 9 months to a year. Like you get a funder say, I'm going to fund the study for you. And of course, you got all the credentials, and you're at, a research university, you got the physicians and everything, but nonetheless, it's about 9 months to a year before you jump through all of the hoops, the IRB, the FDA and the DEA. And there's an interplay between them because no one wants to approve anything until everyone else like approves it. And it's like, believe it or not, there's no good, you got to constantly remind the IRB, like, can you basically say you're okay on everything else until without the FDA approval, because we don't want to send a protocol to the FDA that we're 3 months into it and then find out that you at the IRB want to change it. And now we have these two like it can be maddening. So it's a huge challenge. And we literally, as you know, Rob, have a bank vault in the pharmacy at BPRU, which I don't have access to and I don't want access to. So we're on, tight security, and it's a lot. I think in like other areas, I'm well aware that the regulations address extremely important things, and this stuff should not be in the drinking water. And, there are risks again. At the same time, you look at it and you say, wow, I've worked with, as Rob knows, like meth and Coke and alcohol, all of the uppers, downers, and all arounders. And like, yeah, this stuff is way harder regulatorily in terms of control than it is like methamphetamine. Like, come on, like, So I think, and I've talked to a few congressional and Senate offices, and there's various efforts afoot to try to address this, both with psychedelics and with cannabis, to kind of loosen up research, keep things safe, but like, how can we, kind of lubricate the system to like not block the stuff intended to, to stop reckless use, like not necessarily hamper research.
Okay, we're going to go to Corey Monley next.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for this great talk. I really enjoy this work, and it seems like one thing that keeps coming up in a lot of the research for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, a lot of the early work in the 60s, a lot of your work is the importance of that mystical experience in supporting those therapeutic effects, whether that's for like smoking or anxiety or depression. And I'm curious if there's anything that, either patients or clinicians themselves can do in sort of those therapeutic settings to increase the likelihood that there will be that mystical experience.
That's great. The great question, Corey. The best that we can take, and I have to say, the backdrop to all of this, that we're still using a clinical model that goes back to the 1950s in terms of what's called psychedelic therapy, with the eye shades, with the laying down on a couch, with the largely introspective, frameworks that go within, wear the eye shades, wear the headphones with the music. Seems to work really good, but it's not like there's been studies like comparing that to something else, and so, but clinically, it seems like those conditions, and by especially reading the writings of the folks doing this stuff, going back, in the 50s even, that it was these conditions, the introspective conditions, combined with the very strong rapport, the safety that someone feels. So I really feel like, and I have a paper that we've recently submitted on this, that these so-called the common factors that research has looked at in terms of like what's predictive of success across whatever your school of thought for different disorders, the things that we know tend to work for good therapy, like good rapport between clinician and the client, and and some of this stuff with roots in humanistic psychology, the unconditional positive regard and things of this nature. It's like that, that those common factors, I think, are just under a magnifying lens here, and but it's the same factors. It's like that person really has to know that they are safe at these various levels, because they can, the experience can be so intense that they feel like sometimes it's hard for someone to imagine, like, oh, I didn't know it was going to be like this. Like they feel like just like they don't even know what it's like to be a person anymore. And it's like this kind of existential dread at sometimes having this experience and this extreme vulnerability. And to know and I've been there in over 100 sessions as the guide, where just to have a human being to hold their hand and say, like, look, I'm with you. I'm not leaving you. You're doing okay. Just breathe and keep with it. We're here with you. It's going to be okay. Like that cuts beyond everything else. And again, I think that's just a microcosm. That's what we need in just any clinical treatment. In some sense, it's just kind of a magnification of that, the sense that you're part of a team and that you've got support and you can let go and you can be vulnerable. So I think those are the factors that increase the likelihood of these mystical type experiences. Because if you have your psychological guards up, it seems like it's not going to happen.
Okay, we are coming up against the end of our thing. We have time for one more question. I know a lot of people had questions. We didn't have a chance to get to them. We're going to turn to Joshua McMillan with a very interesting question about sort of advocacy work for promoting this science. So Joshua.
Hi, Matt. It's an honor to speak with you today. Your work actually inspired me to go back to school and see if I can be where you're at someday.
Oh, nice.
Really speak with you.
Thank you.
I'm president of Students for Sensible Drug Policy here at KU, and I'm wondering what specific political action we can promote that would really help the field of psychedelic science grow, such as rescheduling, removing roadblocks. I know Rick Doblin at MAPS talks about a lot of the political and social roadblocks that are causing problems for psychedelic science. What can we do to support you?
Concerning this work, I would say something that's often not thought about is like encouraging research and a good environment for that research at your local university, and encouraging any potential for funding at that university. I mean, I've had discussions with the major folks involved with these like local initiatives, and we don't have time to get into it, but there's tons of differences between the whole history of cannabis policy and psychedelics. It's like what we're doing is analogous to the development of Marinol in the 80s, like, because it's not the mushrooms, it's psilocybin. So like, there's zero controversy associated with Marinol, and it's not, everything we're doing is 100% like, there's no conflict between state, local, and like federal law. So some of these local initiatives have, they'll misstate that, now that said, I'm supportive of decriminalization of drugs. It's actually even more important for meth and coke and heroin, because we just have tons of data on it. Like that's, that like these things aren't the right way, like giving people criminal records and separating families and all of this are like not good ways, and reducing educational opportunities rather than increasing are like really bad ways to deal with the very real problems of drugs, including addiction. Nonetheless, that's across all drugs, and including ones with, horrible, associated with some horrible harms. So while I'm supportive of decriminalization, efforts in that sense, some of these things say, oh, look at all the promising work from Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College, therefore decriminalize mushrooms, in Denver. And it's like, that's a really weak equation. It's like, that's not the rationale. And so I guess I would encourage, in terms of SSDP, which I'm familiar with and actually started a chapter many years ago at University of Vermont, encouraging like a fruitful environment for research, including if there's any funding in a state. I've encouraged some of these local initiatives, like, what about doing something that might be in conflict with federal law, like encouraging your local university system to mandate some research on this and set up because once it's a clinical trial, then it could be as large as you want to, as long as it's approved. It's like, it's 100% in line with with the law at every level. So kind of thinking outside of the box, especially within a university system where this is very relevant, thinking about what can really directly facilitate the FDA development, rather than just, and it's not always like, the things that are that are within the wide scheme of activism that you might think of.
Great. So on behalf of the CLC leadership team, I want to thank you, Dr. Johnson, for an excellent talk. We didn't get a chance to hear all of the questions, but there were many excellent and interesting questions. I'm sure you can Google Dr. Johnson and perhaps send your questions via email. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to address those. I want to thank the attendees for taking your time today to join us for today's lecture. Just a reminder that we have 2 more seminar talks this semester. Next month, we have Jessica Salvatore of Virginia Commonwealth University. And then in November, we have Dr. Trinette Clark-Goings, who will present on November 20th. You can visit addiction.ku.edu/events for Zoom registration information. And we also now have a Twitter feed. So it's @AddictionKU on Twitter, where we're posting content, and we'll also post some of the archives of these talks. So thank you again, Matt. It was wonderful to have you. And we'll see everybody next month.
Thank you.